This is me teaching Nurse Emily the concepts of how I conduct a meaning of life discussion with patients. Sharing this teaching moment hopefully will give patients some insight into what to expect and how we are structuring this discussion. Emily wasn't mic'd up, so her voice might be a bit faint. My mental structure is we start with meaning, we then get a vision, and then we get targets towards that vision. These are sources of meaning that are common to all humans, so everybody wants them to some degree. Everybody to some degree wants growth, some degree wants community, intimacy, family. We all want these things to some degree. But you can absolutely see when someone's like, no, personal growth is a big one. Their whole being changes in the way they talk about it. So, meaning of life. I think a couple things. Number one, as I've thought about it, I've gotten greater insight into my own sort of meaning of life over time. So part of the importance of teaching you is, I think inevitably we sort of spring this on patients because it's new and different. And then the first blush answers are okay, but they're not always going to be dead on point. So having the conversation over and over again is going to flesh that out better. I think the best versions of the meaning of life are if the patient is able to articulate that meaning in response to an open-ended question. So I start with those, and then I do kind of a review of the sources of meaning that I've found to flesh out other potential sources of meaning, see what resonates, see what doesn't, and it just continues the conversation. So I try to emphasize the open-ended stuff more, and then eventually kind of have the less open-ended stuff. So the open-ended questions, it's interesting because with the general population, you can ask, if you won the lottery tomorrow, what would you do with the money? Because having money and health are very similar in that they are freedom-based concepts. Is what would you do with more freedom than you have, or without the constraint of having to work to earn a living? So that's part of it. But many of our patients have multiple millions of dollars. And so it's not as helpful because it's not an academic question anymore. And they are struggling often. That's often what I don't know but you've noticed that, but like, I think our patients who are at the higher end of the demographic do struggle with this question as well. All my life, I've been working to get my company up and running, and that consumed 100 hours a week. And now I've sold it. And yes, I'm a multi-millionaire, but I have lost a reason to get up every morning.
Like, I've noticed a lot of reasons, or a lot of things that they want to focus on is like things that have nothing to do with money, which has been super interesting when I've talked about meaning of life to people. It's like, I have successful clients who like want to focus on producing art or music, like things that are just about things they enjoy and not like super success like driven things.
Yeah, I mean, they've got the success, right? And so been there, done that kind of. The other one that comes up a lot, I think, is transitioning to a family focus. Is, hey, now I'm ready to have kids. Now I'm ready to focus on having a better relationship with my partner, with whatever. So in terms of what questions to ask, there's a bit of an engagement. If the person already has multiple millions, that framing of the question doesn't work. If they don't, it's a good framing. Is, what would you do if you won the lottery tomorrow, right? And I'll even often precipitate, like, and you won the lottery tomorrow, after you buy the house and the car, then what would you do? So there's some material expenditure, that's great. So, but pushing people sort of past that, I'll just include that in the question, right? So that's one way of framing it. I think the next way of framing it, if you live a great life, you're finally on your deathbed at 120, right? And you look back at your life and you say, hey, I'm 40. So from age 1 to age 40, I did great. I did everything I could. I became a doctor, whatever. And then from age 40 to age 120, I really killed it again. And I was a huge success because I did what? What were the things that when you're looking back, you say I was really successful? I think that's a very valuable framing, the retrospective framing. The third framing that I haven't found the exact right question for, but even this is probably the most powerful, and when I really dial in the question, it'll be the most direct, is what things would you do even if you knew the path toward doing them involved a large amount of difficulty or suffering? And I think that cuts to the heart of meaning even better than the other questions, because I think in our society we're given the message that pleasure or happiness is the goal. But obviously there are things we do that make us unhappy, that are unpleasant, that are difficult, and we actually seek those things out. We seek out challenges, and that sort of counters the narrative that all we're after is pleasure or contentment, and cuts toward, no, we really want meaning and fulfillment, and then happiness afterward. And so the things that you would be willing to do and would pursue even if they were difficult or cause suffering are the big drivers of meaning, I guess. And maybe not infinite suffering. I think there's plenty of people that would say, oh, an intimate relationship, self-included, like an intimate relationship is very important to me, but I wouldn't continue that if I were being abused, or if, I mean, there are limits to whatever, but it is still a dream. It is still even if it, because it is going to be difficult to maintain an intimate relationship for a long period of time, and I would want to embrace that difficulty. So yeah, those are the three open-ended framings I think I've found.
And you start with those in the meaning of life meditation.
Yeah, I start with those as prompts to start exploring what they say. And then I think the trick, so to speak, is genuine curiosity and a drive towards specificity. So if I say intimate relationship, then the question is, well, what does that look like? Is that friends? Is that sexual partner? What would be a successful intimate relationship? So just a genuine curiosity to flesh out the real specifics until I have a very clear picture in my head as to what that would look like at the very end. And so then we're not exiting, but we're transitioning meaning of life to vision. So that's kind of my mental structure, is we start with meaning, we then get a vision, and then we get targets towards that vision, steps. So in the discussion, you're always a little bit kind of moving between those, and you kind of have to know that you need all of them, because people will often say, well, I want to gain 5 pounds of muscle in the next year and lose 5% body fat. Well, I mean, that's a very clear vision of what they want in the next year. So great, you jumped a step, but then you have to tie that to a meaning, and so you have to ask, great, that's a cool target, I'll write that down, but why? Why do you care? Yeah, what's the meaning behind it? So people will jump around between target, vision, and meaning, and whichever one they jump to, you have to flesh out the rest. I think the challenge for us as we're sort of developing these ideas is figuring out how do we, and actually if I'm being really precise on that, just seeing it written on the projector there, meaning, vision, plans, targets is probably a better, there probably is one more step there. Vision is, in my mind, is the final vision, is we're talking about physical improvement. So what's your vision of your ideal physical self? That's the long-term vision. The plan is sort of the next year. What's the 1 year plan? And then targets, I would say, are sort of more so the plan would be like, I want to lose 5 pounds of fat and gain 5 pounds of muscle or whatever. And then the targets would be, well, I'm going to work out in this way this many times per week. So that's sort of a weekly. So the meaning is sort of the driver, and that's the kind of important part, and the rest are sort of timeline differences. And obviously specificity differences. So along with being weekly, it's much more specific. And the real question is, as we start doing this, one of our patients I just saw scheduled another visit. I started with sort of I didn't know this structure very well. I started the prototype of exploring this idea 1.5 years ago, 2 years ago. And then the pandemic and this and that, and never revisited it. I didn't have the structure in mind, so it got dropped. And recently kind of tried to reopen the topic, and hopefully we'll keep building it up. But we need to be more regular about fleshing that out.
And tying it into their whole healthcare plan.
Yep.
Adding a meaning to the physical things we're needing to take care of, I feel like is going to go such
Yep.
a long way.
Yep. I think the spreadsheets we've developed are really powerful. I think those will continue to refine in terms of their accuracy. But the combination of spreadsheet with meaning and targets, meaning plans, targets, and then the problem list of what problems we're trying to solve and fix, and having that not only in our head but in the patient's head as we keep having these conversations, is there's problems and there's growth, and we're trying to do both. I think that framing is incredibly powerful. So yeah, so how often to revisit this conversation, I don't know. What's the exact rhythm between sort of weekly or bi-weekly or monthly check-ins, going through the spreadsheet as it is and just kind of keeping it. We're now executing on the targets. We're not rethinking the targets, right? Versus, is it every 6 months? Is it once a year we rethink the targets? How often does that happen? I don't know what that rhythm is yet.
I feel like the 6-month check-in is great, and then if a client had like a huge change in their life, like as far as just a big check-in, but then like the maintenance check-ins, some people are meeting weekly. I think some people could do all just monthly.
Yeah. I think the other thing is, in terms of the real meaning, because sources of meaning shift, as we talked about. If you talk to that same CEO before he sold his company, he's going to talk about the company. That's the big driver of meaning for him. The impact he's making, the lives he's affecting, the technology he's introducing, whatever it is. Once he sold the company, that is a big shift in era, right? Or this is where or there's a shift in era, and that's why they sell the company, right? And so I think that's the other reason to maybe do it at least yearly, to sort of check in and say, hey, how are you feeling about this goal, this life plan? So anyway, we'll find a rhythm. I suspect it's yearly, maybe every 6 months to really do a retargeting. Probably yearly is even better than 6 months, honestly. And then kind of everybody will have their own rhythm. Do we need to check in every week? Do we need to check in every 2 weeks, every month? How often are we going through that spreadsheet? Which, of course, the spreadsheet will eventually become an app, right? Right now it's a spreadsheet, but it'll eventually kind of have the form of an app. And ideally, they're looking at it, we're looking at it, and we're having these check-ins literally on the same page about, hey, this is what we're talking about. So.
Yeah, that'll be way more accessible and on the front of the minds.
Yeah.
Sweet.
And the only caveat, is just what we started with, is as I've thought about my own meaning of life, I would give you a different, better answer now, even though I haven't changed era. I just didn't have the words maybe the first time I thought about my own question. Is if you just sprang it on me the way we were springing it on patients, they're going to struggle to find the words. So anyway, those are the first 3 questions. What would you do if you won the lottery, if you didn't have financial constraints? What would make you feel like you'd been a success if you're on your deathbed looking back over your life? And what are the things you're willing to suffer for that you would pursue even if they were difficult? Then I go into the specifics. So we've identified 7 or 8 sources of meaning that are pretty common. So progress towards your personal ideal, growth, community, family, intimate relationships. It's interesting how those 3 are so different. They're all relational in some way, but they're very different people in a lot of ways. Yeah. Growth, community, family, intimate relationships, a self-expression or creative expression, making an impact on the world, collecting beautiful experience, and discovery or exploration.
Would that be like discovery, exploration on anything that is wanted to be explored, or is that like more specific to a person's growth?
There are 2 categories that I'm still trying to figure out. So is spirituality a part of growth, or is it its own category? I don't know the answer to that. And is building or making things a part of discovery and growth and exploration, or is that different? Learning can be growth as well, but innovation. So it's not like learning in terms of receiving information is more personal growth. Learning in terms of innovation or inventing is discovery, exploration. Okay. Right? But then that invention semantic carries with it a certain building, making. You are making something new when you invent something. Now, if you build an equation, It's a very abstract notion of building. But I think there is a tie-in to the idea of even carpentry, right? Which the desire to do carpentry is very different than the desire to paint, because the desire for painting is self-expression. There's an emotive, expressive aspect, whereas the desire for carpentry is usually a building aspect. There's a makingness, making something useful, right? And I can't tell how, I feel like there's a link to innovation there. There seems to be a lot of overlap, but maybe it's its own category.
What about with creative expression?
What about it?
Would the building of something be able to be in that category?
It could, and I think that's part of what we're trying to get at is, okay, you want to build things. Is that because you want to express yourself creatively, or do you just want to build because you need to build? And that's the cool thing about sources of meaning is there, like, it's very reasonable to say, well, I want an intimate relationship so that I can have a family, right? But it's also very reasonable to say, no, I want an intimate relationship as an end in itself, not for any other purpose, right? I may also want a family as an end in itself, but that's not the sole driver towards having an intimate relationship for me. So I think that's a little bit what we're trying to flesh out is, at what point does asking why stop making sense in that person's unconscious? That individual may say, well, I want to have an impact on the world so that I'm admired enough to attract a mate, right? And so the impact on the world is actually merely a proxy for intimate relationship, right?
So the motivation's just going to be different for each person, and that will throw it into a different category.
And I think what I've noticed is, at some point there isn't a why. It just is, because that's who I am. The why is their innate sense of unconscious impulses, and there is no the question genuinely does not make sense anymore. It makes sense grammatically, but it doesn't make sense to their unconscious motivational set. Is, why do you want an intimate relationship? I just do, period, right? That's the real answer. And so they may struggle, they may try, but you're kind of watching for that moment where there isn't really a why, and they start struggling to even answer, because they recognize that the question is grammatical, but their unconscious says there is no answer to that question, and so they'll start really struggling to answer why. So yeah.
Clues us into where they're at with it.
Yeah, totally. I think the really cool thing about the categories is you can see it on their face when you say it, right? Is if you say, hey, these are the sources of meaning we've kind of found so far. Maybe there are others we don't know about. Let's go through them one by one. How do you feel about personal growth? And they'll talk about it. And these are sources of meaning that are common to all humans. So everybody wants them to some degree. Everybody to some degree wants growth. Some degree wants community, intimacy, family. We all want these things to some degree. But you can absolutely see when someone's like, no, personal growth is a big one for me. That is an absolute driver of whatever. Their whole being changes in the way they talk about it. And then they'll be like, yeah, I kind of want family too. But it's a much more sort of casual thing. And so I think the other big addition recently is not only identifying the sources of meaning, but ranking them and forcing a ranking. I think that really starts to clarify. And I do allow co-ranking. So if they're really like, well, intimacy and discovery are pretty much tied, that's fine. I'll mark them both as number 1 or number 2 or whatever. Okay. It doesn't have to be a strict ranking, but there's definitely a hierarchy.
It just helps to prioritize what are we focusing on during the week or between follow-ups.
And I kind of tell people, I was like, look, one source of meaning leaves you very unidimensional, and people really start struggling with a loss of identity. They feel that they've been subsumed into their role. So if the only source of meaning is your company, then Zain Hakim doesn't exist anymore. I'm merely Dr. Hakim, right? My entire existence is subsumed into the role, or I'm merely CEO of RiverRock, right? I see this most with moms. That's the biggest one, where mom is so caught up with the parenting that she loses other aspects of herself and then feels, wait, I'm not a person anymore. Where did I go? But can happen with any of them. Two, a little bit leaves you in a dilemma. Is, am I this or this? Right? And that's a little bit uncomfortable. So I think that people need a minimum of 3 sources.
Okay.
5 sources of meaning is like 100 hours a week.
Okay.
So if you're genuinely pursuing 5 sources, you probably can, but you are committing to a very intense workload because it's a lot of hours. So somewhere between 3 and 5, maybe some people can do 7. There are some hyper efficient people out there, and they often will be our patients. Roughly minimum of 3 and maximum of 5, maybe 7 if you're really a driven and hyper efficient person. So
Cool. Okay. Well, that's really helpful to see how that's structured.
to see this structure in action, check out Nurse Emily applying these concepts to give Dr. Hakim a meaning of life interview of his own. Click this video.